There has been a draw for the late debate tonight. It was submitted by the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova. Therefore, be it resolved that the government conduct further research into the potential devastating effect on the lobster industry in this province before listing cuss as a species at risk. We will commence with the daily routine. Presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on May 16th, 60 additional private sector organizations signed the Nova Scotia Come to Life Charter, pledging to become ambassadors for Nova Scotia, promoting the province and its many attributes wherever they do business. And whereas those new members include singer-songwriter Bruce Guthrow and comedian Rod James. And whereas these new charter members are well connected to the rest of the world and can help us expand our message to a much broader audience. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House welcome and thank our newest charter members, and always remember Bruce Guthrow's message. We have much to be proud of, and I am happy to stand with the rest of the Nova Scotia Come to Life charter members to sing Nova Scotia's praises. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Gaelic Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I read my resolution, I want to draw the attention to the House to some visitors I believe we have in the gallery. First of all, Mark Allman, who is a writer and director of the film The Wake of Colin MacLeod, Nona McDermott, the producer of The Wake of Colin MacLeod, and Kathleen Reddy of the Office of Gaelic Affairs and an instructor with the Gaelic Society of Halifax, and Gaelic students presently involved in a 6-week Gaelic language immersion course sponsored by the Gaelic Society of Halifax and members of the Halifax Gaelic community. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, they are behind us here on the West Gallery and over here also. So they're all around us, Mr. Speaker. Very pleased that they were able to join us this evening. And I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas commencing Sunday, May 25th, the Office of Gaelic Affairs is sponsoring a Gaelic film series featuring great storytelling and breathtaking images from an exciting lineup of award-winning Gaelic films from Canada, Scotland, and Ireland. And whereas Gaelic language filmmaking is beginning to flourish on both sides of the Atlantic, and whereas the Assembly recognizes that a Nova Scotia produced and directed short Gaelic film, The Wake of Colin MacLeod, has created a great deal of enthusiasm in the Nova Scotia Gaelic community and speaks to the potential for further development of Nova Scotia Gaelic resources throughout the film industry. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House commend and congratulate all those involved in Gaelic language filmmaking here in Nova Scotia and make every effort to attend one of the Gaelic film series screenings scheduled over the next 4 weekends throughout the province. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Keene Canada Incorporated, which employs 475 individuals in Nova Scotia, was recently selected as one of the best employers for new Canadians. And whereas Keene recognizes the international credentials and work experience of immigrant job seekers and pairs immigrant employees with workplace buddies who help them adjust to the Canadian culture. And whereas Keene works to improve the business communication skills of the company's new Canadian employees by providing on-site English in the workplace programs annually, therefore be it resolved that the provincial legislature extends sincere congratulations to the management and staff and of Keene for this work and the company's outstanding contribution to the economic and cultural growth of our province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that at a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April the 13th to the 19th was National Public Safety Telecommunicators Week, and whereas 911 call takers and emergency dispatchers work around the clock, 365 days a year to protect the health, safety, and property of Nova Scotians, and whereas many lives are saved each year thanks to the dedicated service of 911 call takers and emergency dispatchers, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House offer a well-deserved thank you to the hundreds of public safety telecommunicators who work tirelessly to preserve the health and safety of Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Honourable the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotian photographer Len Wegg with writer Bob Bancroft and with cooperation from the Department of Environment has produced a beautiful book called Wild Nova Scotia, depicting wonderful photographs of the wilderness, of the province's wilderness protected areas. And whereas Mr. Wegg has just received the Mayor's Award for Excellence in Book Illustration at the 2008 Atlantic Book Awards for his photographic portraits of nature. And whereas Mr. Wegg has generously agreed to allow his photographs from his book to be used by Communications Nova Scotia in promoting the province, therefore it be resolved that all members of this House join the people of Nova Scotia in congratulating Mr. Wegg and Nimbus Publishing for their contribution to the promotion of Nova Scotia's most beautiful natural treasures, our protected areas. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 148 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Engineering Profession Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 148 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Engineering Profession Act.
Bill 176, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 148 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Engineering Profession Act.
Ordered that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, before I introduce the bill, I'd like your indulgence to make an introduction.
Please do.
Thank you. We have in the East Gallery this evening joining us to witness the introduction of a bill, 4 members of the Nova Scotia Association of Naturopathic Doctors, Dr. Glenna Morris, Dr. Rosalind Heyman, Dr. Carolyn Sturchy, and Dr. Sandra Murphy, and I ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting Naturopathic Doctors.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting Naturopathic Doctors.
Bill 177, entitled An Act Respecting Naturopathic Doctors.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Victor Tomachek's dedicated service to the labor movement includes service as a national representative of the historic CBRT and GW, then of the CAW, and most recently his selection as the Atlantic Regional Director of the Canadian Auto Workers. And whereas he He has been outspoken in his support of Cape Breton's transport and economic links, public health care, workplace health and safety, the rights of working people, and the economic future of Cape Breton. And whereas, in addition to his tremendous service in the labor movement, Victor Tomacek is a devoted father of 3 and the husband of Norma Tomacek, herself a widely recognized community leader. Therefore, be it resolved that as Victor Tomacek's friends and colleagues celebrate his retirement from full-time service in the labor movement, this House of Assembly join them in offering Victor and his family our thanks for the public spirit he has demonstrated on behalf of Cape Breton, his province, and his country. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on May 18th, more than 8,000 runners made their way through the streets of Halifax and Dartmouth as part of the 5th Annual Blue Nose International Marathon. Whereas this event, the creation of Jerry Walsh and Rod McCullough, not only encourages healthy living and physical fitness, it also raises money for the YMCA of Greater Halifax and Dartmouth Strong Kids program. And whereas Terry Malloy of Bridgewater won the 42.2-kilometer marathon with a time of 2 hours and 48 seconds, and Leah Jaboir of Halifax won her 2nd consecutive women's marathon in 3 hours and 17 minutes. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly recognize the important impact the Blue Nose Marathon International Marathon has on the community and congratulate all who participated in this year's race. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas sports had an impact on the political career of Barry Trenum, whereas Trenum's numerous years in school, senior, industrial, and old-timers softball and hockey leagues taught him the importance of being a team player, whereas Barry's venture into municipal politics began in 1977 as a councillor, becoming mayor for the town of Trenton from 1981 to 1997. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House applaud Barry Trenum's contribution to 2 decades of municipal politics, sports in Pictou County, and his recent work and dedication with the Pictou County Sports Heritage Hall of Fame. Mr. Speaker, request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the former member for Dartmouth North, Jerry Pye, is a tireless worker and advocate for his community and the causes he holds dear. And whereas among Jerry Pye's many achievements was the enactment, exactly 3 years ago, of legislation requiring the Minister of Health to exempt community transportation organizations from hospital parking fees, and whereas that legislation was recently proclaimed, taking full effect this month, reducing the cost of transport for patients, especially people with disabilities. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize that Jerry Pye's dedication to a better life for people with disabilities and for all Nova Scotians continues to have a positive effect in our province. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1971, Pastor Leslie Ingram felt the calling to become a minister, and whereas on April 30th, 1976, Pastor Ingram graduated with honors from the Bible College in Ontario, and whereas Pastor Ingram celebrated 30 years in the ministry in October 2007, therefore, be resolved that members of this House recognize Pastor Ingham for his dedication and service for the past 30 years and wish him well as he continues to grow his congregation at the Emmanuel United Baptist Church on Montague Road in Westfall, where he has served since January 1991. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Member for Victoria, the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas basketball great Michael Jordan once said, "You have to expect things of yourself before you can do them." And whereas this is obviously the philosophy used by both the Cape Smoky Elementary School girls and boys basketball teams, who played hard and with lots of spirit throughout the 2007-2008 season, and whereas games and practices for all the players on the Cape Smoky Elementary teams would not have been possible without assistance from individuals such as Johnny Buchanan, Joe McNeil, and Brad Robinson. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud the time and dedication of both players and coaches of the Cape Smoky Elementary School basketball teams this past season and wish them every future success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many years ago, people in various communities throughout our province recognized the need for fire protection, and whereas the commitment of the founding members is only accentuated by the exceptional longevity of volunteer fire departments, and whereas on March 29, 2008, the Uniacke and District Fire Department celebrated 60 years of service to the Mount Uniacke area. Therefore, be it resolved, this House of Assembly congratulate the members of the Uniacke and District Fire Department for 60 years of dedication to the residents of Mount Uniacke and surrounding area. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year the Canadian Lebanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry recognize an individual who has contributed to the business community by awarding their Lebanese Business Person of the Year award. And whereas this year's recipient is Halifax businessman Andrew Metledge, an accomplished real estate developer and contractor. And whereas Mr. Metledge, who immigrated to Canada with his parents at the age of 12, has had many career accomplishments, including being the youngest Lebanese developer to reach a 400-unit portfolio, a feat he accomplished at the age of 29. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the legislature congratulate Andrew Metledge on being named Lebanese Business Person of the Year and wish him every success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Wayne and Nicole Olton of Martock will represent Atlantic Canada in the Canadian Young Farmers event in Calgary this November, after being named Atlantic Canada's Outstanding Young Farmers for 2008 in March. And whereas Wayne and Nicole believe strongly in buying local, and Nicole recently said that when you visit the meat store on their farm, you never have to ask if the product is local. And whereas besides producing and processing direct market beef, turkey, and other poultry in Martock, they also raise 15 varieties of exotic animals such as elk and wild boar, while also managing a 40-acre apple orchard and a 600-acre woodlot. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House compliment Wayne and Nicole Olton for winning the prestigious 2008 Atlantic Canadian Outstanding Young Farmers Award, while wishing them every success in Calgary this November. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the highest award accorded to a firefighter is to be recognized by their peers as Firefighter of the Year, and whereas Jason Stewart is a well-trained and highly committed firefighter with the Pictou Fire Department, who volunteers with his time and effort to help the Pictou Fire Department carry out its responsibilities. And whereas Jason Stewart has been recognized by the Pictou Fire Department as a co-recipient of the Firefighter of the Year title. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this legislature congratulate Jason Stewart of the Pictou Fire Department for receiving the Harold Hemmings Award as the 2008 Firefighter of the Year. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, whereas Mr. Graham Crosby, a well-known resident of Glace Bay, has worked as a social worker in Glace Bay for 30 years, and whereas Mr. Crosby, an office supervisor with the Department of Community Services, oversees employees, acts as a liaison, and community services clients and employees, and implements new training programs, and whereas most recently Mr. Crosby was involved with the Department of Community Services retraining and upgrading program to
Order,
assist
please.
and
I'm
encourage...
having trouble hearing the member. The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay.
Would you like me to start again, Mr. Speaker? Whereas most recently Mr. Crosby was involved with the Department of Community Services retraining and upgrading program to assist and encourage clients to enter the workforce through upgrading their education and skills. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate Mr. Graham Crosby on his retirement after 30 years of dedicated service to the Department of Community Services and wish him a happy and fulfilling retirement. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas immigration has given Nova Scotia many great entrepreneurs who have added to the economic strength of the province. Whereas Wadi Affairs, arriving in Nova Scotia from war-torn Lebanon in 1976, has built a thriving architectural, engineering, construction, and property management firm employing 20 professionals. And whereas Atlantic Business Magazine named Wadi Affairs as one of the top 50 CEOs in Atlantic Canada, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Wadi Affairs for his inspiring climb to this pinnacle of recognition and wish him continued success as CEO of WM Affairs Group, along with his notable community volunteer efforts as chairman of the board for Pier 21. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Honourable the member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Speaker, thank you. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, whereas residents of 8 Canadian cities participated in a walking tour event on May 3rd and 4th to celebrate the legacy and ideas of urban activist and writer Jane Jacobs, who championed a fresh community-based approach to city building, and whereas Jane Jacobs saw cities as ecosystems and promoted higher density, short blocks, local economies and mixed uses, and actively discouraged the car-centred approach to urban planning, and whereas Halifax residents Jane Wright and Jane Kansas conducted the Jane's Walk in Halifax on May 4th, touring the North Commons area, a vibrant area of mixed uses from the commercial and industrial to residential and artistic. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize the role of Jane Jacobs has had in developing the concept of the modern urban environment, and be it further resolved that the members of the House thank Jane Wright and Jane Kansas for initiating the first Halifax Jane's Walk and encourage them to make this an annual event. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 14-year-old Jeffrey Dugas of New Edinburgh is an avid bowler and has represented Nova Scotia at national events, and whereas Jeffrey participated with Team Nova Scotia at the National 5-Pin Youth Challenge Championship in Ottawa on March 27 to 30th, 2008, where he won a bronze medal, and whereas Jeffrey also won a bronze medal at the Youth Bowling Canadian Championship in Edmonton from May 3rd to May 5th, 2008. Therefore, be resolved that members of this legislature congratulate Jeffrey Dugas on his 2 bronze medal achievements and wish him continued success in future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I would ask waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas David Wilson, a Truro businessman, and his late brother Peter are being inducted into the Nova Scotia Business Hall of Fame for their contribution to the commercial, recreational, and cultural sectors of Nova Scotia's economy. Whereas David and Peter Wilson, the 3rd generation in the family business, grew the company to include multiple divisions and over 500 employees. Whereas the Wilson Fuel Company was chosen as one of Canada's best managed companies in 2007, the Wilson Group of businesses includes Wilson Fuel, Curl Control, Parsboro Metal Fabricators, Ski Wentworth, and Crab Mountain. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House congratulate David Wilson and the late Peter Wilson on their induction into the Nova Scotia Business Hall of Fame on June 12, 2008, and thank them for their contribution to commerce, recreation, and culture in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas William Patrick Martin, known as Bill to his many friends, was at home on the Northwest Arm from his birth in 1915 till his death in 2008, and whereas always having a love for the sea, Bill Martin served as a wireless operator in the Royal Canadian Navy during World War II, then returned to work for Canada Customs as Registrar of Shipping. And whereas Bill Martin was generous in sharing his passion and skill in sports including paddling, sailing, rowing, cross-country skiing, and hockey, and demonstrated leadership in many capacities, including Commodore of the Armdale Yacht Club, leading the first organizing committee for tall ships at Halifax, founding member of the group which revived rowing on the Arm, and sailing in many Marblehead and Newport Ocean races, while rowing competitively well into his 70s. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly express its sympathy to the family of Bill Martin and recognize him as a great sportsman and teacher who was a tireless role model and visionary leader responsible for reviving some of Nova Scotia's great sporting traditions. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on May 1st, Quebec City launched the first French language 211 service in North America. And whereas the 211 service can be described as a ladder to the services and is an effective way to help assist members of the community who are in need and to help fight poverty. And whereas being a highly beneficial program, the people of Nova Scotia would also benefit from the implementation of the 211 service. Therefore, be it resolved, members of the House of Assembly congratulate Quebec on having the first French language 211 service in North America and encourage government to take steps towards implementing this service for all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 15-year-old Matthew McDonald has been a patient of the IWK since he was 9 months old, and in recent years has dedicated much effort annually to his lemonade sale on Clyde Avenue, Sydney Mines, raising thousands and thousands of dollars to help other children. And whereas at a special ceremony at Memorial High School, Matthew was named the 2008 Children's Miracle Network Champion Child for the IWK Children's Hospital in Halifax. And whereas the IWK Telethon will take place May 31st and June 1st, when Matthew will once again be raising funds locally while serving as champion child. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Matthew and wish him continued success in his fundraising activities and on his personal journey, offering hope and inspiration to all. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for the past 9 years, the Atlantic Book Festival has showcased many of the talented writers, poets, and illustrators throughout Atlantic Canada, whereas the 2008 festival featured readings, workshops, tours, book launches, and children's activities with celebrations in Halifax, Dartmouth, St. John, Sydney, Truro, Pugwash, Charlottetown, and St. John's. Whereas on May 12th, the Atlantic Book Award winners were announced at Alderley Landing Theatre in Dartmouth. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate first-time illustrator and Halifax resident Richard Rudnicki for winning the Lillian Shepherd Memorial Award for illustration with his depiction of Judith Merrick's story of one duck's quest for a good meal in Gracie the Public Gardens Duck. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying yes. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Digby Choral Federation will be holding its first ever High Seas in Digby Choral Festival, May the 23rd to the 25th. And whereas the High Seas in Digby will bring together singers from community and church choirs throughout the area under the direction of Douglas Hales. And whereas the goal of the High Seas Mass Choir is to have 200 voices singing together in the beautiful stone church located in St. Bernard, Digby County. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly recognize the many efforts of the Digby Choral Federation and wish them success this weekend in their singing adventure. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas from May the 11th to the 17th, Canadian Police Week honored police officers from the public safety and security they provide for their communities. And whereas Nova Scotians can be proud that police officers from across the province bring a high level of professionalism, courage, and commitment to their work. And whereas Shelburne County police officers are dedicated to their profession and diligent in their performance to maintain safety in our streets and throughout the areas of our communities. Therefore, it be resolved that the House of Assembly offer appreciation to the police officers of Shelburne County and commend them for their public safety and security they provide to people in various communities. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Community College has named a new principal for their Strait Area campus. Whereas Mr. Tom Gunn, who is currently the academic chair of NSCC's School of Business and School of Health and Human Services, will begin his role as of July 2nd of this year. Whereas he will be replacing Mr. Bert Lewis, who will be transferring to a project management role in the NSCC School of Trades and Technology, a post he will keep until his upcoming retirement in January of next year. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate Tom Gunn on his appointment as principal of Strait Area Campus of the Nova Scotia Community College and wish Bert Lewis continued success in his new role and upcoming retirement. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia has had fully elected school boards since 1991, and whereas locally elected, locally accountable school board members give citizens a direct voice in public education and school governance, and whereas these board members play an important role in shaping policy for the operations of their boards, while at the same time bringing forward public issues and concerns. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly call on the government to work closely with the Nova Scotia School Boards Association and the province's 8 regional school boards to strengthen and support the roles of school board members as democratically elected officials in their communities. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The Honourable, the member for Halifax Clayton Park on an introduction.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate the interruption for an introduction. I'd like to draw the House's attention to the West Gallery, and we're joined tonight by Tim Outit, who is the new councillor for Bedford in the by-election that he won just recently. I wonder if we'd give him a warm welcome. Welcome. Thank you.
We would welcome all visitors to the house here tonight. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce has a mandate to foster a strong, competitive economic environment that benefits Pictou County and all Nova Scotia, and the mission of the Chamber is to make Pictou County a preferred community in which to live, work, and do business. And whereas the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce believes that sustainable economic development must be driven by the private sector and that the issues and concerns of the membership should remain the focus of the Chamber's agenda. And whereas Jim McConnell, Edward Ripple, and Ellen Fleming were instrumental in forming the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce in February 1983, therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce on its 25th anniversary and commend past and present executive boards and members for their dedicated service and commitment. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. We will now move on to orders of the day. It's time for oral questions put by members. The time now is 6:44, and we will go to 7:44. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you will be to the Premier. After Victoria Day, the number of visitors to Nova Scotia starts to increase significantly. In many vacation destinations, these visitors may encounter a shut-down emergency room. Another ER closure in Pugwash made the news today. New Waterford's ER closes again this week. Rotating summer closures in Cape Breton were announced last Friday afternoon, and the reason given for these closures is a recruitment and retention challenge. So my question to the Premier is this: why has his government failed to recruit or train enough healthcare workers to keep ERs open?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised the Leader of the NDP is asking that question here tonight, just after last week, Mr. Speaker, when he and his party voted against a budget which meant more money, Mr. Speaker, for hiring more professionals to staff not only our hospitals but our ERs across Nova Scotia, that would see more nurses and will see more nurses at the bedside, Mr. Speaker. That will put in place, Mr. Speaker, a self-care, telecare service, up to $4 million for that, Mr. Speaker, available 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, Mr. Speaker. And now this week he speaks on the other side, Mr. Speaker, saying that we need more. And when last week he had the opportunity to stand in this place, Mr. Speaker, and be counted for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'm doing today is standing in my place and pointing out that after 10 years of that government, things are worse, not better. Mr. Speaker, recruitment and retention of healthcare workers is critical in providing quality care in a timely manner. A number of healthcare workers met with NDP MLAs today. For years, those healthcare workers have been urging improved training and recruitment to no avail. They are worn down by this government's failure to recruit or train enough co-workers. Instead, Mr. Speaker, the Premier threatens healthcare workers with the loss of their democratic rights. So my question through you to the Premier is this: why are empty threats that antagonize nurses and other healthcare workers this Premier's only answer to the recruitment, training, and retention challenge that puts healthcare workers under such stress?
The Honourable the Premier.
I am proud to lead a government that has been elected by the people of this province for less than 2 years, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of the fact that this government has put forward once again a balanced budget for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. while that side of the House and that leader voted against additional dollars, Mr. Speaker, to expand the nursing seats at St. FX University and Cape Breton University, this side will stand up for nurses in this province and for additional seats for our hospitals and our healthcare system.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's clear that the Premier doesn't want to answer the question that is put to him. This government wants to transform healthcare, so it says, yet it antagonizes the very people who work in the healthcare system. To sit down with the representatives of healthcare workers and plan how to improve healthcare, and in particular, how to improve the recruitment, retaining, and retention of needed workers, the Premier must drop his antagonistic gesture. So my question through you to the Premier is this: why does the Premier stubbornly cling to his failed idea of stripping away workers' rights, even though the drumbeat of ER closures tells Nova Scotians that it's time for a new direction?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the same old NDP, Mr. Speaker, the same old NDP that stands by the big unions, Mr. Speaker, and the union leadership, but that doesn't stand by, Mr. Speaker, the average Nova Scotian. Well, Mr. Speaker, this side of the House stands by the average Nova Scotians, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, we're increasing the number of residency positions in the budget which they voted against last week. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we're investing another $262 million in our continuing care strategy for the seniors of our province, Mr. Speaker, so that we can see additional beds, Mr. Speaker, in our long-term care facilities, so we can see additional opportunity for them to receive the care from their loved ones in their homes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and that is why this government will continue to focus on what makes common sense for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier, Mr. Speaker. On January 17th of this year, his Minister of Health issued a press release accepting all the recommendations contained in the Provincial Health Services Operational Report, or as it's known, the Corpus Sanchez Report. Mr. Speaker, recommendation numbers 25 and 31 focused around the establishment of a clinical services task force, which was to deliver its recommendations by no later than April 1st of this year. This task force is of great significance to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, as its members will determine which services will be offered in what hospitals and what communities throughout this province. So my question for the Premier is, would the Premier please table in the House the recommendations that were brought forward by the Clinical Services Task Force?
Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there are 103 recommendations through the FSOR report, all of which, Mr. Speaker, not only the government has endorsed, but each and every district health authority, Mr. Speaker, in this province has endorsed the fact that we do need change within our system, changes which will make a real difference for those living out in our rural communities, which will make a difference for those working in our healthcare professions, Mr. Speaker, and most importantly, will make a difference for the patient, Mr. Speaker, and that is what the focus of the government is on. Mr. Speaker, I do not have at my fingertips the recommendations with respect to 25 to 31 offhand, but I will certainly pass on the member's question to the Minister of Health and provide him with an update with respect to the recommendations.
The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay, on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Corpus Sanchez report acknowledged and endorsed the great work of the Clinical Review Committee that was produced over 7 years ago. And at that time, the Making Better Healthcare Decisions for Nova Scotia report acknowledged that some form of emergency room coverage would be available as a core service in every hospital in Nova Scotia. In the Corpus Sanchez report recommendations, hospitals designated as primary care hospitals or community health centres may not have 24/7 emergency departments. My question for the Premier is then, given that both of those reports were endorsed by the Health Department and your government, could you indicate whether you endorse the recommendation that will see some form of 24/7 emergency room care in hospitals, or the recommendation that's going to see emergency departments in this province close?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Speaker, as we have said in the past, as I've said, as the Minister of Health has said, Mr. Speaker, there will not be any closures of emergency rooms in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government values the fact that each and every one of those play an important and integral role in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker. One of the key aspects which is aligned with that, Mr. Speaker, is the rural healthcare strategy. And, Mr. Speaker, we all recognize that we need to work with those who are our frontline healthcare workers, with our professionals, our district health authorities, the board members, to find solutions, Mr. Speaker, to deal with the many challenges that many of our small healthcare hospitals find themselves in today. And that is this government's commitment, Mr. Speaker. That is this government's commitment to work with those individuals to find solutions which work.
The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay, on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, as we sit here right now, there are planned emergency room closures throughout this province, and especially in the Cape Breton region, that are planned for the entire summer, Mr. Speaker. According to the Corpus Sanchez report, the Health Minister should have on his desk right now recommendations on which hospitals are going to be designated primary care hospitals and community health centre facilities, and what facilities are going to have emergency departments. So my final question for the Premier: will the Premier tell his Health Minister to release that information to all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated in my previous answer, I would bring to the attention the question of the member to the Minister of Health with respect to the recommendations and the timelines, and I will get further information for him, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question will be through you to the Minister of Justice. The Minister's department has shown a disturbing disregard for the health and safety of corrections officers. On several occasions, we have raised the concerns expressed to us by corrections officers at the Burnside facility. But it took the escape of a dangerous offender before the government finally paid any attention to those concerns. Now, Mr. Speaker, we see a similar pattern of disregard for health and safety at the Cape Breton Correctional Centre. Even though asbestos was discovered at that facility some time ago, the department failed to inform employees as it is required to do. So my question to the minister is this: why did his department fail to disclose the presence of asbestos at the Cape Breton Correctional Centre as required?
Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the NDP party, his statements are totally ludicrous here this evening. Mr. Speaker, if he wants to get up and challenge this government for being responsible, for acting in a reasoned and indeed accountable approach, then yes, he can do that. But he can't stand in his place in this House and say that we have not acted in the interest and the safety and security of the workers, of the inmates, or the public at large. It's shameful what he's doing here.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government's own rules require that when asbestos is discovered in the workplace, the Joint Health and Safety Committee must be advised. The department's press release of May 16th says that the asbestos issue was raised several months ago and that the presence of asbestos was confirmed on April 25th, yet, Mr. Speaker, the correction officers were kept in the dark. My question to the minister is this: why did the department ignore the government's code of practice for managing asbestos and allow correctional officers to continue to work in potentially unsafe conditions?
Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as usual, the NDP's accounts of things is different than reality. Mr. Speaker, when the government became aware of the situation, the appropriate measures were taken, the protocols were followed, Mr. Speaker, and indeed all of the necessary measures were in place. So if he wants to get his facts right first, Mr. Speaker, and get some research done properly, then maybe we can have a proper question period.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his final supplementary.
Speaker. My final question will be to the Minister of Environment and Labour. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice has an appalling record when it comes to the health and safety of corrections officers and inmates. The Labour Department's review of conditions at Burnside found many shortcomings. Now, at the Cape Breton Correctional Facility, we find a flagrant disregard of health and safety procedures. So my question to the Minister of Labour is this: your department recently laid charges against the Department of Community Services when it failed to disclose the presence of asbestos in public housing in Cape Breton. Will he investigate the way in which the Department of Justice mishandled this case?
The Honourable the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think he's asking me in my capacity as Minister of Labour and Workforce Development. Yeah. Anyway, as the member correctly noted, we issued a report on May 9th. The Occupational Health and Safety Division of the Labour and Workforce Development Department, and they indicated at that time there'd be ongoing discussion with management, with the employees on the internal responsibility system, and at that time we'll be happy to reveal more data if it comes forward.
The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development. The Minister's Department has a code of practice for managing asbestos in buildings that states when asbestos is found to be present, the owner should immediately inform occupants, maintenance staff, and outside contractors of potential hazards created by the presence of asbestos-containing materials in the workplace, and inform the Joint Health and Safety Committee where they exist. My question to you, Mr. Speaker, is the Department of Justice required to follow the code of practice on asbestos in buildings?
The Honourable the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Mr. Speaker, absolutely.
The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Nova on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with the discovery of asbestos in the Cape Breton Correctional Centre facility and the Department of Justice failure to inform workers and the Joint Health and Safety Committee, it appears this government hasn't learned anything from its past experience with asbestos in Cape Breton public housing. It appears that in both cases, the proper process were not followed. My question is for the Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development. What steps has he undertaken to ensure that government departments will follow his department's code of practices?
The Honourable the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The operative word in the member's question is appears, and certainly it's a word which he would want to use. On the Occupational Health and Safety Division, we look at facts, not appearances, and I stated before in response to the Leader of the Opposition that on May 9th, Occupational Health and Safety produced a report, and we indicated at that time more work would be ongoing into the workings of the internal responsibility system, and we will do that, and if more facts come out, we'll report on them.
Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Nova on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there is a code of practice to follow because asbestos is a deadly product. The biggest problem is we don't know what government buildings contain asbestos. The Canadian Cancer Society believes a public registry of buildings that contain asbestos should be maintained. So my question to the Minister, why hasn't he done any asbestos audit on all the government-owned buildings to protect Nova Scotian workers?
Honourable the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I suspect that question would be better directed towards the Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure, Renewal, but I'll answer that. I'll take that under advisement and get back to the member on it. Oh, and by the way, the member's facility with English language was noted as he talked about fish hooks in people's lungs. Very graphic language.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the pain at the pumps and the hole in the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians continue to grow at the hands of this government. Last week, the price of gas increased again by more than 3 cents a litre. Once again, the difference between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick is greater than the tax difference, and Nova Scotians are struggling to cope with the Premier's flawed system and inflated price. So my question to the Premier is, exactly how high does the price have to go before Nova Scotians can get a much-needed break at the pumps?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member will know, that last year we did a review, a premature review, I might say, of the system of price regulation here in Nova Scotia. We had said at that time we made some adjustments as a result of that review. At that time we committed to do a full review at the end of one particular cycle. The end of that cycle is soon coming up, and already staff have begun to put the process together. We'll see a full review take place.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party, on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Motorists who use diesel have felt the pinch more than anyone. For the first time, the price of diesel in many parts of this province is more than $1.50 per litre, and it's higher than all other maritime provinces. Nova Scotians are tired of paying a higher price, they are tired of paying higher taxes, and they are tired of this government's flawed regulated system. So my question to the Premier is, why do you continue to refuse to put in any measure at all to lower the price of petroleum products in this province?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, as I said last week in response to a question, roughly about 90% of the diesel that is sold in Nova Scotia is not subject to regulation. It's sold by the large commercial consumers and make a deal with the suppliers and do it. But I will tell the honourable member an interesting thing that I got today about regulation is that communication came to me saying that one of the people who sells bulk diesel was complaining because the price of the pump was cheaper than what he had to sell it for.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party, on his final supplementary.
So, Mr. Speaker, is he fighting for a regulated system or an open market system? Which is it? My question, Mr. Speaker, is many Nova Scotians are looking for answers. Motorists around this province see lower prices in New Brunswick and PEI, and they are confused. Your federal cousins are telling you to lower the tax and remove regulation. Consumers in this province are telling you they want lower prices. So my question to the Premier is, when will you put Nova Scotian pocketbooks ahead of your government's?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, let me say that there is nobody on this side of the House would not like to see lower petroleum prices in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick or any province in Canada. We know that these prices are making Nova Scotians somewhat change the way of life. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, we have put in place a system which we think helps rural Nova Scotians. It helps ensure a supply in rural Nova Scotia. It helps to protect retailers from the margins for all of those that are involved in the system. Mr. Speaker, if information and evidence comes forth to say that this is not an appropriate system for Nova Scotia, then obviously changes would be made.
The Honourable, the Member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. For 2 years, Alice Housing has been providing an intensive program to help children who have witnessed abuse or who have been abused. Healing the Bruises is the only interventionist one-on-one program east of Montreal for children in second-stage housing. The program has been nationally recognized, yet Heal the Bruises does not get one thin dime of funding from community services. I asked the Minister of Community Services, why not?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to stand in my place, Mr. Speaker, and speak about the fine work that's going on across this province with the broad spectrum of women's centres, Mr. Speaker, transition houses, Mr. Speaker, indeed the men's and women's transitional facilities across this province. Mr. Speaker, but I have to tell you that I find it extremely challenging to answer a question from a member of the NDP who stood in his place last week and voted against additional dollars for those types of programs, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, with that said, this side of the House supports all programming, Mr. Speaker, from one end of this province to the other, and will continue to do so, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the Member for Halifax Citadel, on his first supplementary.
Minister's ability to deliver a canned response with so much passion and so little meaning. Frozen and minimal operational funding at Alice Housing makes it difficult to offer its much-needed programs. Alice Housing gets only 11% of its annual budget from community services. Staff must fundraise nearly half of its operational funding, and costs for heat, electricity, insurance aren't going down anytime soon. So I asked the Minister, given the valuable work of Alice Housing, why won't her department find ways to increase its financial support, specifically to support Healing the Bruises?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't take any personal offence to my honourable colleague's attack on how I answer my questions, Mr. Speaker, because I know that this side of the House supports
programming, Mr. Speaker, from one end of this province to the other, and they do not. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I will continue to work with the Premier, with our Cabinet, with the government to ensure that funding is put in place for a wide arrangement of supports for children, for families, for women, for men across this province, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that that side of the House, the NDP party, will continue to put barriers up in my way, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Citadel on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not programming we oppose, it's programmed answers we oppose. Mr. Speaker, this is the very problem Justice Nunn talked about in his report. Failure to support children and youth at risk now will cost much more in the future, both financially and in lost human potential. Given the very few hands-on programs that have been created in the wake of the Nunn report, I asked the Minister, why hasn't her department looked at supporting or expanding successful programs as a beginning in addressing the many gaps in services for children and youth at risk?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, why didn't we? Mr. Speaker, indeed we did. We did, Mr. Speaker. Why didn't that member and why didn't that party vote yes for the $2 million to invest in the Nunn response by this government that member referenced, Mr. Speaker? That's the real question here this evening, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Economic Development. The Halifax Chamber of Commerce recently presented the results of the Chamber's 2008 economic scorecard with 3 ratings: green for above target, yellow for areas needing improvement, red for serious situations that need to be addressed now. One of the reds, Mr. Speaker, Port of Halifax container cargo dropped 4.5% in 1 year. The port is operating at less than half capacity. Your own export strategy praises its natural assets. But, Mr. Minister, what exactly are you doing to help the port?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad the honourable member has discovered economic development and the port. There hasn't been much discussion about it in the House this session. But, Mr. Speaker, we have been working very closely with the Port of Halifax in dealing with both short and long-term strategies. Indeed, I've spent 2 occasions with the Port of Halifax in India, looking at the future and developing new business for this area. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a very long-term project, but it will indeed pay benefits for the Port of Halifax and the province of Nova Scotia as we move forward. And, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member will pay close attention as he sees new developments taking place in the port, and some of the customers who have been dealing here, who have moved away for a short time, who he will see coming back in the very near future, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister, your government said in its budget that you would establish a Gateway Council sometime this year. Thanks for adopting the idea we suggested last March and again last fall. However, details on this council...
Order, please. The member for Pictou East has the floor.
Thanks for adopting the idea we suggested last March and again last fall. However, details on this council are a little lacking. I ask the Minister to tell the House what the mandate of the council will be, who will be on it, and how you will pick those members.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the fundamental difference, of course, between this side of the House and that side of the House is they abandoned the idea of the council. We embraced it in the budget. They voted against it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From Yarmouth to Sydney, Gateway hopes and expectations are rising. You said you're spending $1 million to raise awareness of its advantages, and there's a lot of brave talk. But when will Nova Scotians have actual, achievable Gateway goals from this government?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the honourable member and all members of the House that we indeed are formulating goals. We are out there promoting the province of Nova Scotia and all of the Gateway attributes that this province has, Mr. Speaker. And we're doing it every single day, Mr. Speaker. We engaged NSBI in that process. We have the Office of the Gateway in the province. We're working with the Port of Halifax and the other ports in this province, Mr. Speaker, and this will become one of the greatest assets of this province as we move forward, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture. Mr. Speaker, recently the Department of Fisheries and Oceans of Ottawa has imposed a shellfish harvesting ban in the Digby Annapolis Basin because of high bacteria count, and the closure has caught the clamming industry and many others by surprise. My question to the Minister, are you aware of the closure of the Digby Annapolis Basin to all species of shellfish?
The Honourable, the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for that question. It is indeed an important one. It's an issue that's of grave concern to the province of Nova Scotia and the Department of Fisheries. We learned late last week that this was a possibility that this would happen. It was initiated by CFIA as well as DFO. They made the decision that the bacterial count in that area was high enough that they should close the area. But Mr. Speaker, through you to the member, our department is working on that. We're keeping a close watch on it, and we expect sometime by the end of the week that there may be a resolve to that issue.
The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the timer of the closure couldn't have been worse for many clam fishermen and others. It may even have a long-term impact on the established markets within that industry. It seems that there's been no communication at all with the industry concerning this sudden closure. So my question to the Minister, what discussions have you had with the federal government about this closure?
The Honourable, the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you to the member for that question. As I've indicated in my previous answer, it is a grave concern to us. Staff in my department, as well as staff from CFIA and DFO, are working together on the issue. Like I said before, we expect that we will have hopefully a resolve to it by the end of the week, and we will continue to work with CFIA, DFO to see that the issue is resolved.
The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in the past, we've seen this federal government make decisions behind closed doors with little communication to our public. In the past years, similar spills have occurred, resulting in the closure of the affected area, but not the entire basin. So my question to the Minister, are you working with industry officials on this matter, and can you tell us why this entire basin is closed and how long it will be closed?
The Honourable, the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Mr. Speaker, like I said in my previous answer, there's probably, we hope that by the end of the week there will be a resolve to that issue. Mr. Speaker, it's I guess of grave concern when CFIA, DFO has to close an area for any kind of closure on any fishery. The clam industry and the shellfish industry is one that, Mr. Speaker, we cannot have contaminated clams or shellfish in the marketplace. It's just totally unsafe. It cannot happen. There's been some issues with sewer treatment plants on that shore, and that's basically the reason why it is shut down.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Transition houses provide emergency shelter for women and children leaving abusive situations. In addition, they provide essential support and advocacy for clients, helping them to access programs and services. Yet once again, operational funding for transition houses is frozen this year, as it has been since 1996. 12 years of functioning with rising costs and frozen funding is taking its toll. I ask the Minister, why won't her department provide adequate operational funding for transition houses?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we do have 9 transition houses in Nova Scotia that provide a wide range of programs and services when required, Mr. Speaker, and they do great work, Mr. Speaker. Again, they have negotiated salaries through the NSGEU that see an increase, Mr. Speaker, in their salary range. And again, Mr. Speaker, we value what they do. We work well, Mr. Speaker, together. And again, without repeating myself, Mr. Speaker, it's very interesting that the NDP now choose to ask questions about funding when last week they voted against the budget.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A 12-year freeze is downloading government responsibilities to community-based organizations. And Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows full well that the 2.9% increase in this year's budget is for salaries and salaries only. This leaves transition houses on their own to handle the rising costs for electricity, heating oil, building maintenance, food, and other day-to-day expenses, trying to get by just as they've done for the past 12 years on completely inadequate core funding. I ask the Minister, where does she expect families to turn if transition houses can no longer function at 1996 funding levels?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I remind my honourable colleague that these are union negotiated salaries, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that that doesn't come as any surprise to the member across the way. Mr. Speaker, we work with all stakeholders. We rely on our community involvement, Mr. Speaker. We work with the excellent staff, Mr. Speaker. We have staff at Community Services who work with a wide range of facilities across the province. And again, Mr. Speaker, we live within our means, and Mr. Speaker, we will continue to support those programs, the transition houses, the women's centres, from one end of this province to the other, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wonder if the Minister realizes that if these transition houses weren't in place, the government would be required to pay for all these services at a much higher cost than community organizations can provide. Mr. Speaker, women and children arrive at transition houses with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They are in crisis and they have serious, complex needs. Shelters need to be able to focus on these families, not on finding the money to pay the light bill. So I ask the Minister, when will she finally show her appreciation for the work transition houses do by supplying adequate funding to these organizations?
You didn't give them any money, though. The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we understand on this side of the House the phenomenal work that goes on across this province through the women's centres, the transition houses, the second stage housing, Mr. Speaker. And I just wonder, Mr. Speaker, if the members at opposite knows that by voting against the budget, they voted against dollars into the hands of those Nova Scotians who need them the most, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development. Last week, guards from the Cape Breton Correctional Facility refused to show up for their shifts on Thursday night and again on Friday morning after the union learned that asbestos had been discovered in the facility. While maintenance staff was informed, the Department of Labour's Code of Practice requires that all occupants and staff in the building found to have asbestos be informed immediately. Mr. Speaker, provincial institutions should be the model of communications on safety matters. So my question for the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development, why wasn't the proper protocol followed and correctional officers informed of this health hazard?
The Honourable, the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I've responded to it previously, but I'll respond again that on May 9th, we The Occupational Health and Safety Division made its report. 14 compliance orders were issued. The Minister of Justice reported that they would accept and act on all of them. At that time, on May 9th, we indicated that more study and work would be going on the internal responsibility system and how it functioned or didn't function properly, and I'm sure this issue will be part of that ongoing study.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party on his first supplement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My first supplementary will be for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, even though most correctional officers in the facility returned to work yesterday, this is yet another warning sign that the Department of Justice is failing in its duty to provide officers with the basic requirements to perform their jobs safely. They are under-equipped, they are understaffed in crowded jails, and now correctional officers in Cape Breton face the fear of an unsafe work environment. Mr. Speaker, government has been talking tough on crime, but they're doing little to aid those in the front lines. So my question to the Minister of Justice is, when will the Conservative government make the health and safety of correctional officers a priority?
Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable colleague and all members of the House. That's exactly what the government's doing. It's been made a priority. We've dealt with things in the order that we've received them in terms of issues and concerns. We've made the appropriate and responsible actions that are required to follow up on those matters, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to do that. All the necessary protocols have been followed with regards to the Cape Breton Correctional Facility. We adhere to the follow-up from the Department of Environment. We'll continue to do that, and we're resourcing our correction services and indeed all of the Department of Justice, and the results speak for themselves in terms of positive outcomes that we're achieving here in this province, thanks to the programming of this government.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Asbestos has been banned from use for some time and for good reason. It is well known that the exposure to this harmful substance can cause scarring of the lungs and has been linked to cancer. Air testing is underway for asbestos at the Cape Breton Correctional Facility, but the results are not expected until midweek. So my question for the Minister of Justice is, what is your government's plan for the staff and inmates if the results show that asbestos is present at the Cape Breton Correctional Facility?
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as people would know, when the concerns were raised and the testing was done following the necessary processes that were laid out, those indicated that everything was within safe and acceptable levels. Any remedial action has been detailed by the Department of Environment. That's been followed up. An industrial hygienist has been meeting with staff and the inmates in that facility. And indeed, as a precautionary measure, Mr. Speaker, we're also doing tests and facility audits within Cumberland and Antigonish counties for those facilities, the two older facilities in the province, just as a precautionary measure. Mr. Speaker, all of these things have been followed up, and indeed the second air tests are coming in, and they're within those acceptable limits, and they'll be issued in the morning. Mr. Speaker, you should have the confidence everything is in order.
The Honourable, the Member for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. The Minister's Department confirmed last week that the spirit, not just the letter of the lunch supervision law, will be followed. And in September 2009, there will be free lunch supervision for all kids in all schools. This comes a year late and dollars short. The Halifax Regional School Board estimates that it has to come up with an extra $2.7 million to put a free lunch program in place. Can the minister tell the House where in HRSB's budget they are going to find this kind of money?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, the whole question of lunch supervision and students staying for lunch is an issue that has existed in this province through all boards for many, many years. And all boards have been able to deal with the issue of supervision of lunch students in a variety of ways. A number of models are used, whether there are supervisors who are hired or whether that supervision is provided by teachers. So what we're saying to the Halifax board is we expect that they will be able to do the same as all other boards. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, throughout Halifax board, there are many, many schools where students are staying and teachers are supervising. Hear, hear.
The Honourable, the Member for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister knows what the current budget's arrangements for busing and lunch supervision is. Boards get their actual costs from the year before, plus a cost of living increase. But, this is the hooker, but The Halifax Board has never offered this program before, so obviously it's not in their previous costs. It needs a cash infusion to get the lunch supervision off the ground. So, Mr. Speaker, through you, my question for the minister, will she authorize a one-time grant to the Halifax Board to get the lunchtime program up and running?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, if he has paid a lot of attention to what I've been saying, he would know that we are giving the Halifax Board 1 full year to implement models that will allow that to be delivered.
The Honourable, the member for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank, on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week the Chronicle Herald quoted the minister as saying, and I quote, "Teachers in many schools supervise students at lunchtime even though their union contracts say they don't have to," unquote. So this is my question, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister think that depending on teachers volunteering is the best way to manage Nova Scotia school system?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I've been involved in the education system for a long time, and I have seen many, many models of supervision to provide security and protection of our students during lunch period. And in many, many cases, in many, many schools, in all of our boards, teachers provide that supervision. And in fact, I was in Halifax, a couple of schools in Bedford 2 or 3 weeks ago, large high school, large junior high, and many students stay for lunch. The principal was giving me a tour of the school, and I asked the question, do most students stay for lunch? And the answer was yes, and we wish they all did. And secondly, how is that supervision provided? And he said, by my staff, I wouldn't want it any other way.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. I'll table a letter from the Dartmouth Adult Service Centre Association regarding funding issues. This organization refers to a crisis across the province for vocational agencies. There's been no change in the operating budget at DASC since 1992. Buildings need maintenance, there are long wait lists for entry into most programs across the province, and there is a serious problem recruiting and retraining staff. So my question to the Minister is, why does the funding freeze continue for these programs?
Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank my honourable colleague for bringing up a group that does great work across this province, Mr. Speaker. I met with various members along with the honourable member to discuss their concerns, to see what type of a strategy could be put in place, Mr. Speaker, across the province to ensure that the adult centres that are doing the work that they're doing from one end of this province to another, Mr. Speaker, do what they're able to do. And Mr. Speaker, had my honourable colleague voted yes last week, he would have voted yes for $6 million more for services for persons with disabilities directly related to his question, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth North, on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They say that we're the party of tax and spend. I can't count how much money she's just spent in the last half hour. Mr. Speaker, the letter states, and I quote, "Our inability to support community clients' needs remains critical. For example, DASC has a current wait list of 33 individuals who are your constituents and who remain at home without vital services. There are another 17 individuals for whom DASC cannot provide services due to lack of funding, staff, and space." My question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the minister is, why are so many Nova Scotians with developmental disabilities waiting so long to get into vocational programs?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, do you know the question is almost laughable, Mr. Speaker. Wants to count the money I spent in the last half an hour? Mr. Speaker, it was well laid out in the 8 hours of estimate debate, Mr. Speaker, we held in this House, where I stood in my place, Mr. Speaker, and explained to Nova Scotians the good work that we were doing on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, that they voted no for. The $6 million is for persons with disabilities, and it includes the exact question that my honourable colleague was referencing, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm going to go off text here for right now, and I'd like the minister to tell me where is the budget line item that tells us where the money is specifically for Dask Industries in this past budget.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, obviously my honourable colleague didn't have enough time in the 8 hours of estimates, Mr. Speaker. I stood in my place for 8 hours, Mr. Speaker, and explained clearly the work that was going on in the Department of Community Services. I'd be pleased, Mr. Speaker, to do it again next year.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, there are hundreds of children in Nova Scotia who suffer from correctable learning disabilities. Frustrated with a lack of progress in the public education system, many students have become disengaged and virtually have given up hope. Mr. Speaker, Bridgeway, Churchill and Landmark East have revitalized their sense of hope. Children who have attended these schools have excelled in the classroom, made friends and have rediscovered the joy of learning. Mr. Speaker, one thing is crystal clear. Their programs work. My question to the minister, will the minister commit to removing the 3-year cap on tuition support so that all children gain the educational tools they need to succeed?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite who knows full well that I have engaged in dialogue with many of the parents, have received correspondence from many of the parents, and in fact have contacted many of the schools, in fact the 3 schools that are designated, to make sure that they work closely with our department. We do not want children left out. We do not want students to not have the appropriate programming to meet their need, and that's why this government introduced the tuition support program, and that's why we extended it to 3 years, and we will continue the dialogue with those parents.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parents have expressed their desire to have the 3-year limit on tuition support removed. Mr. Speaker, Molly Thompson wrote to the Premier and copied to me. I'm a student who attends Bridgeway Academy and have been going here since grade 9. I previously attended an HRSB junior high school and the system failed me. Molly further explains, one teacher called me stupid in grade 8 for not understanding the number line. My mental health became unstable and soon became depressed. I'm doing the public school program with the help of Bridgeway and my marks have soared. Please make the right decision. What would you do if your kids had a learning difference? My question to the minister, will the minister tell Molly Thompson and her family why this government refuses to remove the 3-year cap on tuition support?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, you will recall that there was a review that I called for on special education in this province. One of the recommendations in that review and report was to discontinue the tuition support program. I did not accept that report. We are continuing with that program. We are looking at the number of students who are transitioning. We have 17 students who are transitioning back next year, and we are continuing to work with the schools to identify the needs of those remaining students.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every child is entitled to an equal education, no matter their geographic location or learning capabilities. The government allocates $6,500 for every student in the public system. If the minister allows the money to follow the student, the province would actually save money. Mr. Speaker, Mackenzie McLeod writes, I know my parents would love to have tuition support so I can go to this school next year. Bridgeway has helped me a lot because in the public school, I was failing everything, and this year I am close to 90%, and my parents are so happy. Without tuition support, it will be hard for me to come back next year. My question to the minister, will Mackenzie McLeod be forced back into the public system that has failed her, or will the minister do the right thing, remove the 3-year limit on tuition support?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And students have been attending the designated schools for many, many years, and that has been a significant cost to the family. With the introduction of our tuition support, we have reduced the cost of tuition to those families. $6,400 is what followed those students this past year, and in addition to that, funding was available for 51 needy families so that their students would have an additional $3,000 support. So we are doing what we can to try to make that available for all students.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Nova Scotians who require wheelchairs face many out-of-pocket expenses relating to their equipment needs. The Abilities Foundation program and special needs funding helps some Nova Scotians without insurance to purchase wheelchairs. Where the funding falls short, however, is when people who use wheelchairs need help with maintenance and repairs. My question to the Minister: why has her government failed to establish a comprehensive technical aids program to address these needs for disabled persons?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, do you know the wonderful relationship that we have with the Abilities Foundation has allowed us to invest, Mr. Speaker, millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, in wheelchair programs for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And last week, Mr. Speaker, we increased that by $300,000 in this year's budget that this side of the House supported, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP did not.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wheelchair users need to have their chairs maintained at least once a year, sometimes more often, to ensure safety and extend the life of the equipment. It's not enough to buy the wheelchair. You have to repair it and maintain it. One wheelchair user without insurance detailed for me the cost she faces just to keep her chair in good repair. General maintenance runs between $50 and $100 a year. Tires need replacing a couple of times a year at $70 and up. New cushions or chair backs are at least $500 to $600 or more when they need to be replaced. So I ask the Minister, why is there nothing in place to help cover these costs for uninsured, low-income Nova Scotians?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, the Abilities Foundation and the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities are the experts, Mr. Speaker, in this area. We are pleased to work with them, Mr. Speaker. It was through our relationship with those two organizations, Mr. Speaker, that government recognized that an increase in the budget was necessary, Mr. Speaker. We put our money where our mouth was, Mr. Speaker, and we supported those requests. And, Mr. Speaker, this side of the House will continue to do that. And, Mr. Speaker, I would certainly hope that the NDP would do so in the future.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, those are a few of the very groups who are bringing this issue to our attention. Mr. Speaker, these wheelchair repairs are just as critical to disabled Nova Scotians as requiring safety vehicle inspections. It's a health, comfort and safety issue, and the costs add up. My question to the Minister: in the absence of a technical aids program, will her department offer help with repairs and maintenance for low-income, uninsured wheelchair users?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest on this side of the House in the needs of Nova Scotians. We'll do so with over $900 million investment in the Department of Community Services, Mr. Speaker, that this side of the House supported and passed last week. We will continue, Mr. Speaker, to invest in a wheelchair program in this province, Mr. Speaker, and through the Abilities Foundation, Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities, we will continue to work in partnership and take their advice and work with them, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that those Nova Scotians who need us most will get that, Mr. Speaker, from this side of the House.
The Honourable, the member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Economic Development. When the Premier announced the Community Development Trust on March the 28th, he specified the town of Trenton as one of the hard-hit places the trust was meant to benefit. The Mayor of Trenton says he repeatedly asks how the town should apply and is still waiting for a straight answer. Will the minister tell the House why the town of Trenton is having such difficulty finding out how to access the trust when you say the town's a model of the kind of community the trust was designed to help?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell the honourable member that if the town of Trenton were to write to the Department of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, that would trigger a process whereby any thoughts and ideas and programs that they have that they feel would be appropriate for their circumstance, that would be given a full and clear airing by the department as well as my own department, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I do want to thank the minister for ensuring that his department finally put some information up on its website about the trust. I note that it stipulates community stakeholders who would like to access the trust will work with the provincial government departments and agencies to develop proposals for funding under existing departmental programs. Mr. Speaker, through you to the minister, does this mean that a community cannot apply to the trust if its needs don't fall under an existing program?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell the honourable member and all members of the House that the Community Trust is available to respond to the needs. We believe the programs that we have in place are appropriate to meet those needs. If, however, Mr. Speaker, a unique circumstance comes forward and it is deemed worthy of consideration by government, then Mr. Speaker will not be held back by any of the words that are on the website at this stage. We will certainly respond to any good ideas that come forward that are appropriate for the interests of this province and the community that brings it forward.
The Honourable, the member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, again through you to the minister, I want to make it crystal clear that we don't oppose this trust, but it's a one-time cash infusion, and it has to be spent so that we get the most bang for the limited dollars that are available. For the sake of towns like Trenton, we have to do this right the first time. Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell us how this trust will help the town of Trenton?
The Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to be working with the honourable member for Pictou Centre with respect to the interests of the town of Trenton, and Mr. Speaker, we'll be able to bring forward programs that will benefit that town. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say that we are, of course, very actively pursuing somebody to look at the facility there and do our utmost to ensure that it continues operating into the future.
The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The time allotted to question period has elapsed. The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Bill number 120, Public Service Act, the Environment.
Bill number 120, Public Service Act for the Environment. The Honourable, the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I've had opportunity to speak about the new standalone Department of Nova Scotia Environment before, and some of the tasks before us, the challenges and the opportunities. And so having had the chance to speak on that in the past, and I'm sure anticipating the opportunity to speak out in the future, I will now take my place and listen to discussion on Bill 120.
The Honourable, the member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise as the critic on the environment for the official opposition on a bill that creates, or more precisely, recreates a standalone Department of Environment. Mr. Speaker, we used to have one of these, but it was eliminated. Now, who eliminated it? Was it the NDP that eliminated it? No. Was it the Liberals who eliminated it? No, Mr. Speaker. It was the Conservatives who eliminated the standalone Department of Environment. It's 6 or 7 years ago now, Mr. Speaker. And at the time, we told them it was the wrong thing to do. The then member for Dartmouth North, not the very fine current member for Dartmouth North, but the previous very fine member for Dartmouth North said very specifically, if there was any department that deserved to stand on its own, it was the Department of the Environment, Mr. Speaker. And other members of the NDP said similar things, warning the government that amalgamating it with other departments was the wrong thing to do. Mr. Speaker, but the government did not listen to us at the time because at the time they had a majority. They could do whatever they wanted. They did do whatever they wanted. They didn't need the support of any opposition party, Mr. Speaker, so they did not heed our advice. And now here we are 6 years later, and they're undoing what they did only 6 years ago, Mr. Speaker. They are creating a standalone Department of Environment and saying, look at us, look how good we are. We're showing our commitment to the environment. We're putting environment in its own department, Mr. Speaker. But it's no wonder that many people across Nova Scotia look at this government's record on the environment and say that it's just a pure record of greenwashing, which is a term used by environmentalists to describe governments and other entities that act as if they're friendly to the environment but are not really. Mr. Speaker, because the essence of this government's position on the environment is the contrast between what they say and what they do. The contrast between the high-flying rhetoric and the on-the-ground reality. And nothing, Mr. Speaker, could be more symbolic of that than the bill that's before us today, creating something we already had, which is a standalone Department of Environment. Because, Mr. Speaker, what they did was they took the Department of Labour and the Department of Environment 6 years ago and they put them together into a department called, imaginatively, the Department of Environment and Labour, with one minister. And so during the estimates debate, for example, we could ask the minister about anything to do with environment or labour or a number of other affairs that were within the competence of the department. This year, they're splitting the department. Now we have a standalone Department of Environment and a standalone Department of Labour, but there's only one minister, the same minister. Mr. Speaker, this is exactly the kind of thing that makes people who care about the environment roll their eyes about whether the government is truly committed to environmental progress or not. They had one department and then they split it into two with one minister. So it's not that this new Department of Environment is getting more attention from the minister. His attention is still as divided as it was before. It's not that the department is getting substantially more resources than it had before, because it's not. It's not that the department's getting a different mandate than it had before, because it's not. It's all the same. The only difference is the name on the sign in front of the office. The only people who are going to be satisfied with Bill 120 are the people who print the government's business cards and who print the nameplates on the minister's door, because they're going to have to be redone all over again. So instead of a sign out front of the building saying Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Labour, there's going to have to be two signs, one saying Nova Scotia Department of Environment and the other one saying Nova Scotia Department of Labour, which of course is precisely what we had only 6 years ago. But all the business cards are going to have to be reprinted. The website's going to have to be redone. All the signs everywhere posted around the province of every kind are going to have to be redone, Mr. Speaker. But not one thing is going to change with respect to the government's approach to the environment. This is something that people refer to as greenwashing, as I've already said. It's something that my colleague from Halifax, Shabakto, referred to as the astroturf approach to the environment, where from a distance something looks green, but when you get up close to it, you realize that it isn't. It's not real. It only looks real from a distance. Let me give some examples, Mr. Speaker. The government's flagship piece of legislation on the environment, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, which the acronym for which is the Environmental GASP Act. The Environmental GASP Act But the problem, Mr. Speaker, with the Environmental GASP Act is that all the goals are in the distant future, long past the expected lifetime of this government. Mr. Speaker, every day that passes brings us one day closer to the end of this government. Mr. Speaker, and also just as significant is that the reporting on whether the goals have been met is not done objectively, it's not independently verified. The government reports on its own progress, as it did last week. So when a student reports on their own progress, you can expect that they will grade themselves rather well. When a government reports on its own progress, you can expect that they will find that they've performed quite satisfactorily, and that's exactly what we got last week, Mr. Speaker. Now, real change would be adopting our proposal for an Environment Commissioner attached to the Office of the Auditor General, such as exists at the federal level. That person would be independent, would be objective, and one of their principal tasks would be verifying the progress made towards the goals in the Environmental GASP Act. Mr. Speaker, there are many things this government could do in the environment. That would be one of them, but so far the government has shown no interest. The government has taken many of our ideas, Mr. Speaker, and they're welcome to them, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're here. And that's another good idea from the NDP, and if the government wants to take that idea, Mr. Speaker, they are welcome to it. It's a good idea. They really ought to think about it seriously. Another example, Mr. Speaker, of the gap between the rhetoric and reality of this government was revealed only a few months ago in the latest report from the Office of the Auditor General, which I happen to have right here. Mr. Speaker, the Chapter 3 of the February 2008 report on the Office of the Auditor General gives what I can only call a devastating critique of the Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division of what was then called the Department of Environment and Labor. And what concerns me, Mr. Speaker, is the department's response to this devastating critique has been to dismiss, to minimize, to split hairs, to split words. I have seen no indication from the minister or his department that they have taken to heart the flaws found by the Auditor General, who we all know is an objective observer of the scene. They only report what they see, Mr. Speaker, and I would have liked to have seen our Minister of the Environment take a lot more seriously the findings of the Auditor General. Let me review them quickly, Mr. Speaker. There are 4 parts to the Environmental and Compliance Monitoring Division of the Department of Environment, and all 4 parts were found wanting. On the first part, Mr. Speaker, the approvals section, the Auditor General says in paragraph 3.8, quote, "We noted the division issued many approvals without all required documentation in place." Mr. Speaker, so on approvals, there are guidelines about what documents are required, and the Auditor General finds not a few, not one, not some. The word used by the Auditor General is many instances where not all of the required documentation was on file. Now, the department's response was, well, it wasn't needed anyway. To which the Auditor General sagely replies, well, if it's not needed, then record that in the file or change the guidelines. All we have now are guidelines that are not being followed in many cases. And when it comes to the environment, Mr. Speaker, that is not acceptable. But what does the government do, Mr. Speaker? They create a standalone Department of Environment with no significant change in resources or mandate. The second duty, Mr. Speaker, has to do with monitoring and inspections. And the essence of what the Auditor General said on this part is in paragraph 3.11, quote, "We concluded inspection processes are not adequate as the division is not meeting its inspection requirements. We also noted monitoring processes could be improved." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, I don't know how the Auditor General could have been more clear than that. inspection processes are not adequate. But does the government respond with paper on how they're going to improve the situation, on how they're going to improve the funding of the Monitoring and Compliance Division, about why Nova Scotians should expect that things will change, Mr. Speaker? No, they do not. They bring forward Bill 120, which changes the name of the department. That is their response. Mr. Speaker, the third part of the Environmental and Monitoring Compliance Environmental Monitoring and Compliance Division of the Department of Environment is enforcement. And on this, the Auditor General says the following at paragraph 3.17, quote, "We found instances where the division's enforcement actions were not adequate," end of quote. There were cases of chronic failure to meet orders of the department, and all the department would do is go out again and ask nicely for compliance, Mr. Speaker. A number of files had no indication that any remedial action was taken or that there was any follow-up. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the fourth part of the division is complaints, how they deal with complaints. Now, this is rather important because the department and its inspectors can't be everywhere all the time. They really do rely on people who know the issues, who know the area, who know what's going on, who know when there's a problem. It may be the color of runoff, Mr. Speaker. It may be when a stand of trees go down. It may be any of a number of things that only local people would truly appreciate. So how the department deals with complaints is important. And here's what the Auditor General had to say about that at paragraph 3.22. Quote, "We concluded the division does not have adequate systems to track and monitor public complaints. While the division has established policies and procedures for recording, investigating, and concluding on complaints, we noted a number of instances where they did not follow required procedures." End of quote. So, Mr. Speaker, there are four parts to the division, and the department came out of this Auditor General's report 0 for 4. Significant deficiencies in every one of the four parts of the division. And this government's response is a bill that changes the department's name. This is why more and more Nova Scotians are noticing the difference between the rhetoric of the government on the environment and the on-the-ground reality. Mr. Speaker, let me turn as another example to this issue of uranium. Where is the Minister of Environment on the fundamentally environmental issue of uranium? Nova Scotia has had a uranium moratorium since 1981. The price of uranium has meant that nobody was really interested in exploring for it anyway. But now that the price is high, the interest has returned. So the question is, will the moratorium hold or will it not? Now, on this issue, which is fundamentally an issue of the environment, we would expect the Minister of the Environment to be leading the way